This podcast is the design of City Sites Urban Media, and our goal is to bring into focus the difference between culture and God's ideas found in His Word. To learn more, go to citysitesurbanmedia.com.
Broader changes in American culture have also had an effect on marriage and family formation. The dramatic decline in church attendance and religious observance is one of these. There are probably other reasons too. Fatherlessness is a hugely complex problem. But the point is, it is a problem, a massive one. And what is remarkable is how rarely that is acknowledged in public. In 2013, as she was preparing to run for president, Hillary Clinton shot a video tribute to single mothers. Quote, "Single moms are the real heroines," she said. "They need even more of the help that grandparents, aunts and uncles, and good friends can provide." The one group that Hillary didn't mention, biological fathers. Studies show that married fathers are by far most involved in their children's lives. You often hear our leaders refer to caring parents or grandparents or caregivers or some similar combination, as if the presence of any involved adult is enough for kids. But that's not true. At least for boys, the presence of a biological father in the house makes all the difference. On at least one occasion, Obama suggested that he understood this. In a 2003 speech about gun violence he gave in Chicago, Obama noted that, quote, "We should do more to promote marriage." Almost immediately, he was attacked from the left. An article in Ebony magazine suggested that Obama's remarks were racist. MSNBC ran an op-ed attacking him, and so on. He went back to platitudes. Hillary Clinton was right about one thing. Being a single mother is difficult. A lot of single mothers work incredibly hard, and they ought to be admired for that. But that doesn't mean that single motherhood is a good idea for society. It's not. It's a tragedy, especially for boys. And the rest of us ought to stop lying about that.
Very recently, I did an interview with a local pastor, Walt McFadden. He has a podcast, by the way, on the internet called Thinking Out Loud, and he was doing a series on manhood, and he had this to say.
It's something that's very close to my heart because I did not know how to be a man from the beginning of my life. Didn't know how to be a man.
So, Walt, following that comment, you went into this long story about why manhood had been such a problem for you. Why don't you summarize that for our audience today?
Well, I watched my father watch my mother abuse my siblings for most of my childhood into my teen years. Even when they came back home to live, then they were so messed up. There was physical abuse, and my father would just sit back and watch and observe. And I wanted him to step up. I wanted him to be a stronger figure. And my default was then to have the same kind of interaction with my wife, to be afraid of her, to fear her.
And so that created quite a bit of problems in your relationship.
Yeah. When we were first married, my wife wasn't doing anything wrong or unusual. I was just afraid of her. An argument always turned into a divorce, or now you're going to leave, or whatever it is. My parents never did divorce. They came into their relationship together through an adulterous relationship. They were both married at the time, and they met each other and left their spouses and got married. I think that was the root, the beginning of my father falling back into that trap of passivity.
So many men in our culture today are viewed as weak or weaker than past generations, and there probably are reasons for that. Spiritually speaking, of course, men oftentimes take a back seat to the female on spiritual things. But what are some of the reasons that you see why men are weaker today than, say, they had been in past generations?
Well, the number one reason is they don't have any role models. What role models do they have in their life? When we have large percentages of young men growing up in homes without the father figure. And regardless of what people say, when the father is not in the home, it makes a big difference. And this started back in the 70s with no-fault divorce. You could just walk out for any reason whatsoever. That started a slide. The welfare system has contributed to that as well. So it's the number one reason is the absence of the role model. Number two is the spiritual war that we're in. One thing that you find when you go back into history and you start to look at some of the various Canaanite gods, the gods of the land that the Israelites were to conquer, they were often a male-female mix. Be like a male with breasts or something like that. And that's always, Satan distorts everything. He takes everything that God has created that's good and he distorts it, and he has a counterfeit. And what we need to do is uncover that and get back to the real thing.
You know, David Morrow, who is an author, broadcaster actually as well, wrote a book a number of years ago called Why Men Hate Going to Church. And he quotes somebody in the book, and he talks about an army of females that are leading the church today.
Well, we send men a lot of signs, the way we decorate, the themes we choose to emphasize, the softer side of Jesus. You know, these are really not as compelling to men as the raw Christ that we see in the Gospels. The preponderance of volunteers that we need in the church, we need people to work with children, in education, music, areas, caring for the sick and the poor, areas where women have traditionally excelled and men have sort of taken a back seat. Leon Pottles, theologian, has a great quote that I love to say. He says, the modern church, it's an army of women led by a few male generals. And so I think what we found is that the way we minister to folks and the things we choose to emphasize in the church really tend to attract more of a female audience.
The idea is that 60% of the churches in America today are females and men are missing. Do you discover that as well in your church or churches you've been a part of?
That's an interesting question, because some of the young guys came to me recently and they said that they feel that the men are stronger spiritually than the women in our church.
Really?
And I don't think the women would want to hear that. And I said, well, I don't think that's quite true, given many examples of strong women of faith. But they said that it seems like the women in the church tend to have a more difficult time getting together into these life-on-life groups that we have and having accountability. I've discovered something that men will go deeper faster. Women will stay on the surface more. But in our church, because I've put such an emphasis on manhood and being a man of God and taking that role, I think it's just an appearance that the men maybe are ahead of the women. And the women, to their credit, have admitted some of this, that they'll stay on the surface forever. They're afraid to get down into those deep issues, and we usually think of them as being different. We always think that women are more willing to share their feelings and their emotions, but they'll oftentimes do that on the surface because men will just kind of come clean. It takes a while to get to that point where they'll just go, hey, I've got this problem, I've got this issue in my life that I need to work on, but it has to be emphasized from the pulpit. The pastor has a responsibility to talk about these issues.
Well, that's what David Morrow says, is that when you talk to a woman about her church, she will talk about those relationships and how wonderful and kind the people are. If you talk to a man, it always goes back to the pastor. Oh, he's great. He's a man's man kind of thing.
Well, I hate to say it, but the most important factor is the pastor. I mean, it shouldn't be this way, but it is. I speak to men and women all over the world about their church experiences. And when I speak to women, it's interesting. When they describe their church, I say, describe your church to me. Oh, there's the most wonderful people there. I have the most wonderful relationships. They have this terrific children's program. I just love the music. And then eventually they get around to the pastor. If you talk to a man about his church, the first thing he says is he talks about his pastor. Our Pastor Joe is just a regular guy. I can really relate to his sermons. Or they say, well, we've got this new pastor and he's really a dud. So the thing is, men tend to see their church through their pastor. If they respect their pastor, if they look up to their pastor as a leader, then they will go to church. They will become involved in church. But if they see their pastor as a dud or a fuddy-duddy, out-of-touch, egghead, whatever, they will not involve themselves in the church. If I could get into the seminaries of America, what I would say is you need to really work hard to relate well to your men, because men will judge the church based on you.
But in most churches today, and we've talked about this on different occasions, that the church is all about relationships. How do you get relationships better, whether it's in your marriage or your work life, etc., etc.? And the other part of much of what goes on in churches, we talk about safety all the time, that everything has to be safe. Christianity is safe. David Morrow had something to say about safety and relationship.
Yeah, and it's all in what we choose to emphasize. There's a large nationwide network of radio stations that's called K-Love. They play contemporary Christian music. And their tagline is safe for the whole family. So they're obviously targeting mothers there who are driving their kids to piano lessons in the minivan and these sorts of things. Well, young boys are sitting in the back of the minivan and they hear Christianity is safe for the whole family. Christianity is safe for the whole family. So when the boys reach 13 and 14 and 15 and their testosterone is raging and they're looking for an adventure, do you think they're going to go to Christianity? No, because Christianity is safe for the whole family. So we tend to emphasize those aspects of Christianity. It's a thing of safety, it's a thing of caution, it's a thing of peace, it's a thing of gentleness, meekness. And then the other big emphasis in the church today is on relationships. 30 years ago, I had never heard a sermon preached from the pulpit about relationships. Most pastors didn't even consider relationships a topic worthy of a sermon. Today, it's hard to go to church and not hear a sermon about relationships. It's become our number one focus.
But in a lot of ways, the church then loses the spiritual content of what I think the Bible is wanting us to do. Relationships are fine, but there's more to the Bible than just relationships.
Just naturally, we know that men are slow.
Slow.
We don't take hints.
Right.
My wife will talk about how she looks and observes at other relationships, and she'll say, I don't think that he's taking the hints. And I say, there are no hints. We don't have a hintometer. We don't receive hints. We have to be told things very clearly. And when we just kind of keep things on the surface, it's that, again, your best life now. And that just wears out after a while. Men are looking for a pastor who will be real. Somebody who doesn't seem to have all the answers, who's willing to share their struggles. So I don't know that it's necessarily about relationships and talking about relationships. It's how we talk about relationships. And we don't say things clearly from the pulpit. This is right. This is wrong. Men respond to that kind of teaching. They also resist the idea when people say, they talk about the Abba Father or saying daddy, or now if you're in the South, you call your father daddy, but here in the North, I don't like that view and perspective of God. I don't like that picture of crawling up into my father's lap as a man. It doesn't do well with me. I'd rather identify with the Jesus who carried the rugged cross. And I want to know very clearly in my relationships, this is what I'm supposed to do, this is what I am not supposed to do. And the other thing I'll throw in is that men do respond to theology. Men want to hear the nuts and bolts of why do I believe? And that's an accusation against the church that is too emotional. But there's a way that we can balance the emotional and the intellectual at the same time. You need to have sermons and you need to have worship songs that have very deep meaning and words, but it's okay for the pastor to cry. It's okay for him to share his emotion. It's okay for him to say, I failed. I haven't lived up to your expectations. What is the number one reason that Dr. James Dobson says marriages fail? Unrealistic expectations. So in everything that we do from the pulpit, we need to be real.
One of the things that I think David Morrow said in his book, Why Men Hate Going to Church, is about the fact that everything they hear from the pulpit is about safety. It's safe Christianity. And so when you mentioned about what men want to hear, is they want to hear the nuts and bolts of theology or the theology behind the old rugged cross, that's something that is missing so often within our churches. And so what we talk about is relationships that are safe. That's one of the reasons men don't want to go to church. So how do you balance, how do you bridge the two, talking about things that are, important for the family, for a female to hear, and at the same time, not dummy down for men and make it so safe that a guy, wants to puke?
Well, I have to confess that women don't always like what I have to say. And there's been pushback through my ministry, not much. If they're honest with themselves, I'm speaking of women, if they're honest with themselves, if they think deep in their hearts, what do I really want? They want their husband to lead. They don't trust men, and rightfully so, because look at the condition that men are in the culture.
The signs are everywhere. If you're a middle-aged man, you probably know a peer who has killed himself in recent years, at least one. If you're a parent, you may have noticed that your daughter's friends seem a little more on the ball than your son's. They get better grades, they smoke much less marijuana, they spend less time playing video games, they go to more prestigious colleges. If you're an employer, you may have noticed that your female employees show up on time. The young men often don't. And of course, if you live in this country, you've just seen a horrifying series of mass shootings, far more than we've ever had. Women didn't do that. In every case, the shooter was a man.
Most of them are not even conditioned to lead their families because they have addictions. They have a pornography addiction. They have an anger issue. They can't handle money. They can't hold a job. And I say to men all the time, if you give her the opportunity to lead, she will lead. She will take over. And again, it goes back to that fighting for your marriage, and explain it always as fighting for your marriage is getting down in the trenches One couple in our church, she talks about when early on in their marriage, he was a brand new Christian and he read in the Bible, it said, don't let the sun go down on your anger. He said, we are not going to bed until this issue is solved. She hated that. She wanted to stew over it for 2 weeks, but he forced her to talk this out. And he was just following the Bible. There is a good example of manhood. God said this is what we're supposed to do. And over time, she says, I have learned to follow the leading of my husband. I fought that early in our marriage.
As a pastor, you're obviously in tune with what the culture teaches and preaches and how it has influence on the family, especially men. Do you think the culture, i.e., you could even use the word demonic parts of our culture, are they targeting men to weaken them and make them be confused and be less involved with the leadership in the home or leadership in culture as a whole? I'll get your answer in a minute, Walt, but first, Tucker Carlson from Fox News had some statistics that feed into that whole idea that men are being targeted.
Here are the numbers. Start with the most basic, life and death. The average American man will die 5 years before the average American woman. One of the reasons for this is addiction. Men are more than twice as likely as women to become alcoholics. They're also twice as likely to die of a drug OD. In New Hampshire, one of the states hardest hit by the opioid crisis, 73% of overdose deaths were men. But the saddest reason for shortened lifespans is suicide. 77% of all suicides in America are committed by men. The overall rate is increasing at a dramatic pace. Between 1997 and 2014, there was a 43% rise in suicide deaths among middle-aged American men. The rates are highest among American Indian and white men who kill themselves at about 10 times the rate of Hispanic and black women. You often hear America's incarceration crisis. Well, that's almost exclusively a male problem, too. Over 90% of inmates are men. Now, these problems are complex, but we know that they start young. And relative to girls, boys are failing in school. More girls than boys graduate high school. Considerably more go to and graduate from college. In schools at every level, boys account for the overwhelming majority of discipline cases. One study found that fully 1 in 5 high school boys had been diagnosed with some form of hyperactivity disorder. That's compared with just 1 in 11 girls. Many of them were medicated for it. The long-term health effects of those medications, not fully understood, but they do appear to include depression in later life.
We're on the wrong track. We think that men should be more effeminate. But the last thing that a man needs in his life is another effeminate man, supposedly showing him how to be a man. That's controversial. I've talked about that before from the pulpit. Some people didn't like it, but I'm not saying that you need to be a man's man, that you need to be, coming home with construction dust all over your clothes and demanding that your wife go and get you a beer. I'm not talking about that view and perspective of manhood. But I think a lot of guys come into church, if they go to church, and they look at this guy up there and they think in their minds for a moment, this guy's never worked a day in his life. He went to school. He came out of school. He took this posh job. He pretends like he has all the answers. And there's his beautiful wife in the front row. It's something that he fails to identify with. In ages past, you would be much more likely to have a pastor who would look at the Amish community. Everybody goes out for a barn raising, right? And you see your pastor out there sweating. And that's why one of my ways that I teach manhood is just take men on mission trips and let them do construction and let them be in an opportunity where they can use a screw gun or a nail gun for the first time in their life. And they love it. And they're out there in the hot sun in Mexico for 14 hours a day, and they'll come away saying that's the greatest trip of my life because they feel like a man for the first time in their life. They were taught some skills. They have some kind of competency.
If Satan ends up destroying the manhood in the home, what's left is what we've seen in culture of female-headed homes, or we see even youth. We worship the youth today. And of course, Isaiah said this that I discovered a number of years ago, that it was a curse on Israel because the men were absent in leadership. And the prophet said this, childish leaders oppress my people, and women rule over them. O my people, your leaders mislead you. They send you down the wrong road. Well, That was a description of what was happening in their culture. The absence of fathers, the absence of male headship. I've always said that culture is no friend to the family, and certainly culture is no friend to males.
Well, there are a lot of reasons that men are falling behind in this country, but a look at the numbers reveals one statistic that tracks the decline of American men almost precisely over time: the disappearance of fathers from the home. Between 1960 and 2016, the proportion of kids living with both parents decreased by almost 20%. The percentage of children living with only their mothers nearly tripled. In demographic terms, this is stunning. Changes to family structure this abrupt and profound typically are only seen in wartime. And yet, if anything, those numbers understate the reality of fatherlessness in America. In the high-income neighborhoods where journalists and policymakers tend to live, not a lot has changed. Most kids there still grow up with their fathers and mothers. But in the rest of the country, intact families are disappearing. According to a 2014 study by researchers at Johns Hopkins University, among younger parents without college degrees, 74% of mothers had at least one child outside of marriage. Out-of-wedlock births are now the rule across the country, not the exception. Increasingly, having a father at home is a sign of affluence, but it is also a cause of affluence, especially for boys. Boys who grow up with a father at home earn much more as adults. Boys who grow up alone with their mothers tend to earn less. They also have more disciplinary problems in school. They read less and less well. They're less likely to graduate from high school or go to college. They are more likely to be unemployed and to live in poverty. They get married less often, and when they do, they divorce more. They're more likely to be obese and to have asthma. They are far more likely to abuse alcohol and drugs, exhibit antisocial behavior, and commit acts of violence. As adults, they're twice as likely to go to prison.
And you had said early on that if you really wanted to take a quick assessment of culture, most of our problems today in society go back to the male.
When Marco Polo went to China, he found certain pockets in Chinese culture where homosexuality had taken over an entire village. And he talked about how the men just laid around in tents together. The women did all the work. And he said these people were so poorly cared for. Just scraggly, dirty kids running all over. And the men just kind of doing their thing and having fun. Of course, he's coming from a Christian culture. He's coming from a different culture where men are leading, and it's just a better culture. When men are not leading, the culture falls apart. If I want to take out some institution, I'm going to go after the head. If Satan wants to take out my church, he's going to come after me, or he's going to come after the leadership. If he wants to take out the family, he's going to take out the father.
And you see that a lot in the failure of pastors today. A lot more are falling morally, etc., etc.
Oh, absolutely. And the pressure on them is overwhelming, that they have to be this perfect model and they can't ever talk about their struggles. If we find it through surveys that 60% of pastors are struggling with pornography, we are doing something drastically wrong. There has to be a place for these men to talk and to sound off, and for congregations to understand your pastor is a human being. He has a sinful bent in his life. He's not the perfect person that you see. And stop putting people on a pedestal and upholding these leaders. You know, somebody has a church of 10,000 and then everybody wants to run out and read their book. How about reading the book for the guy with a church of 50 and somewhere in rural Minnesota or rural Kansas? Does that guy not have anything to say about manhood or anything to say about God? We're listening to the wrong people. We're upholding the wrong people.
Well, you know, as we kind of bring this to a conclusion today, Pastor Walt, what draws men to be committed? When I look at men on a Sunday afternoon, they're committed to their NFL or their NBA or the World Series or something. They're really committed to their sports, and you can't draw them away. So what makes that happen for a man, and yet church does not?
I always say it's amazing to me that we can recruit an 18-year-old into the U.S. Army, train him for 6 weeks, send him off to war, and they will run into a hail of bullets. But ask a man to pray over his family, and he wimps out. He can't do it. It's the most nerve-wracking thing that he's ever experienced. We don't have the right worldview in the church. We're not teaching people and not understanding that we're in a war. This is a battle for your family. This is a battle for your legacy. You can't sit on the sidelines. You have to get engaged. You have to take up arms. Ephesians chapter 6 tells us that. put on the full armor of God. And this touchy-feely Christianity that we give people, it doesn't fly with men, and we can see it in the evidence is there. And all across the culture, everywhere, men are becoming more absent. Isn't that interesting that we're trying to teach men to be soft, to be kind, to be effeminate, whatever it is, and men are becoming more and more disengaged. 2/3 of college graduates are women. In some colleges, it's 80% of the graduates are women. Men are failing all over our culture, and the enemy is winning. And we need a message to tell men, get engaged in the battle.
Okay, Pastor Walt, it seems to me as men are becoming more and more absent in a lot of different essential places in our culture, how do we push back on that? How do we help their masculinity be rediscovered?
One woman in our church said, she was sharing her testimony about her history in her church, and she said, there would be times when our pastor, meaning me, would say something, and I would say, I can't believe he just said that. Could he say that? Can he get away with that? Men are attracted to other men who have guts, who are brave, who are courageous, and people want answers. They may get angry, they may even leave the church, but I have a responsibility as a pastor to give them the faithful and true Word of God, regardless of how the culture may respond to it. And that's what we need more of, is courageous pastors.
Well, if you've enjoyed the interview here with Pastor Walt McFadden, Pastor Walt has a podcast on the internet called Thinking Out Loud. Pastor Walt, where do people go to hear your commentary on a variety of things from week to week?
You can go to our church website. It is City View Church, and the website is CVC, City View Church, MPLS in Minneapolis.org, CVCMPLS.org, and look under resources and you'll find my podcasts.
Thanks for listening. For more information, go to citysightsurbanmedia.com.